Hello everyone, it is Friday in the Clown Decade, so I am deciding to have some fun. And the fun today includes laughing at Grace Blakeley, who is someone who is taken seriously because, quite frankly, she is privately educated and went to Oxford to do a PPE degree, so she is very good at sounding like she's knowing what she's talking about without actually knowing what she's talking about. For reference, a lot of our high-end politicians go to Oxford to do PPE, so you know what I mean by that. But I think my favourite Grace Blakeley story of her professional life is when she was an economics correspondent for Vice in the UK, and she literally lasted 5 articles. This is 5 articles, and I am pretty sure it is because a lot of complaints came in because of this second article. Less money, more problems, I'm swimming in debt even though I have a job. And it was effectively an agony aunt article of someone writing in saying, I'm in a lot of debt, I'm working a lot of hours, and I don't particularly know what to do. And just to sum up Grace Blakeley's advice was this: if understanding this makes you angry, i.e. that capitalism sucks, then the best way to respond is to join together with others who have faced similar problems. Is there a union in your line of work? If so, reach out to it. If not, you could join a general union which may also be able to provide you with advice in dealing with your debts and support in your relationship with your employers. By engaging with the labour movement, you'll not only increase your power relative to your employers, you'll also find support and solidarity from those who have faced similar struggles. In other words, I don't really have any advice to give you on being in a massive amount of debt, other than please join any socialist union you can, and maybe they'll have better advice for you. I mean, that's pretty embarrassing when you are the economics correspondent and someone is coming to you with a finance issue. The idea is that he's writing to you for advice, and if your advice is just go somewhere else, I'm not surprised you only lasted 5 articles. And the final paragraph is no better. The powerful want working people to feel powerless in the face of a system that treats them as though they are only worth as much as their next paycheck. Can't pay your debts? Try being less lazy. Or try saving money, or try getting a better job. But they know as well as we do that no amount of extra work or saving can change the way the system works. Again, a lot of people say this. I bought my own house via 3 years of saving. You can do it. By only coming together, realising our collective power and demanding change, can we fix our broken economy? The most important thing to take from this experience is that you're not alone, and that things do not have to be this way. That's the advice for someone struggling with thousands of pounds of debt, by the way. Don't worry about it, you're not alone, and things don't have to be this way. Come join the labour movement. Like, embarrassing stuff. And so when I see Politics Joe, literally yesterday, release an interview with Grace Blakeley about how capitalism has enslaved us all, it was like a dream come true. And don't get me wrong, this is probably going to end up being multiple parts, because it's an hour long, and hey, I actually have work to do beyond my lunch break. So, since I'm on a time limit, we may as well get right into it. Please take it away, Politics Joe.
We're talking because of this weighty tome: vulture capitalism, corporate crimes, backdoor bailouts, and the death of freedom. A lot of substance, which we're going to get into.
Far be it from me to criticise a professional interview when I don't even have the means to make a professional interview, but why, if you're saying, oh, this weighty tome, look at this book, you don't actually show the book? I mean, already that's a bit strange, but yes, this is going to be one of those interviews where a socialist tries to cope and seethe about how corporatism, that basically every capitalist is against, is actually capitalism, and how capitalists like me absolutely love bailouts when they're the last thing I want.
For those who don't know who you are, how would you like to introduce yourself?
So I'm Grace Blakeley. I am a writer. I write about political economy.
Grace Blakeley, economist. No, she's not an economist. She doesn't study economics. She isn't researching economics. She is an economics and politics commentator. She's a journalist. Just because she commentates on politics doesn't make her a politician. So why does commentating on economics make her an economist? That doesn't make any sense. I would love to see the people that are actually paying for Politics Joe, because an awful lot of this is free, by the way. I would not be shocked if Politics Joe has similar backers to those of, say, The Guardian and other left-wing outlets, because Politics Joe is actually relatively popular among the young. And I keep saying young and involving myself in that. No, I'm nearly 30. Now, when I say young, I mean 30 and below. And this is probably part of the reason you're seeing such massive support for the progressive leftist alliance throughout, Parliament and all that, because an awful lot of these people honestly don't know what they're talking about. And we're going to see
This
perfect example with Grace Blakeley here.
This is my latest book. I've also got
QVC
available
style.
in all good bookstores. I'm also a staff writer for Tribune magazine, and I do bits and pieces in the media.
And this is a thing you've got to keep in mind with journalists like Grace Blakeley. She isn't actually an expert in anything just because she's a writer, by the way. I mean, if you study PP at Oxford, obviously you've got a good education. I'm not going to deny that. But one thing that you have to realise about smart people isn't necessarily that they've got correct opinions. What being smart really means in this day and age, and I suppose every day and age, I'd have to look more into specific academic history here, but what being smart actually means is that you are very, very good at rationalising your positions, your hypothesis, your morals, let's say. And that's what Grace Blakeley is. She is actually very good at rationalising the positions that she's in, when at the end of the day it's just her intuition. And her intuition is like that of many other leftists, which is just, I want to maximise care harm. I think capitalism is harmful. I think socialism is caring. Therefore I want socialism. And then everything else revolves around that. All of her brain power goes into trying to justify her positions. Not whether they're right or wrong, not critically evaluating them, whether, the pros and cons weigh up. No, it's just, this is good, this is a conclusion, how do I rationalise it? And that's actually why it's quite entertaining to break her apart, because they are well rationalised, but they fall flat on their face. And well rationalised arguments that fall flat on their face are my absolute favourite to go through.
In that subheading there, Death of Freedom, I think that's the bit that stands out to me most. Can you start us off there? Why is it that we're not free in our capitalist system?
I mean, this is loaded already. An awful lot of capitalists don't deem what we are in at the moment a capitalist system. I suppose the biggest example would be, I'll go with the YIMBY example, I guess, but the Town and Country Planning Act, where effectively local councils have final say of whether something can be built or not, with absolutely anything. Some examples are some disused car parks haven't been able to have some houses be built on them because some people complain that don't use the car park. There are also plenty of other acts where effectively the only thing you can actually build as a developer is Barratt homes that just look garbage. But other examples that are less controversial in my circles may include the fact that we have the highest tax burden since World War II. Public spending once again is at an all-time high. We've got incredibly high borrowing. And then of course, going outside of economics, we have all of the issues with free speech. I mean, recently, a man was put to jail for 2 years for printing out stickers that were racist in nature, and ideally just for him sticking it on public property, that should be a slap on the wrist fine. But no, it was racist in nature, therefore it needs to be 2 years jail. I mean, that was ridiculous, obviously. We saw that effectively with 2 weeks of government work, we can lock everyone inside their homes for a health scare, and that lasted effectively 1.5 years. And then if you want to get into corporations, well, they're all doing the government's bidding effectively. Why do you think we've got all this diversity, equity and inclusion nonsense? Why do you think we have a load of laws that are upping corporation tax, that are upping other taxes, that make it really difficult for smaller businesses, which I have experience in, by the way, because I work for one, actually make it as a successful business? Why is it them lobbying the government for these laws? The reason isn't capitalism. This is the thing, corporatism isn't called capitalism by many economists because it's not considered to be the same thing. It's only Marxists that do, and the reason they do that is because, yes, sure, these companies do still have CEOs and all that, but you actually look into, say, who owns McDonald's, well, the answer is that it's owned by different shareholders because it's a publicly traded company. 70.14% of the ownership of McDonald's goes to institutional investors, which may sound to you like, oh, so it's big businesses? No. That means pension funds. That's just random business investments, ISAs and things like that. And actually individual owners only make up 0.31% of McDonald's. In other words, a lot of these big companies, they are owned by ordinary people. If you're paying into a private pension or if you have an ISA, you probably own part of McDonald's because these pension funds, they spread out their costs and they probably put some of that into McDonald's because it's pretty obvious McDonald's is only going to grow because people love fast food.
I'm really glad that kind of came through as the central message of the book, because that is really where I wanted to start.
I mean, again, I agree that the world we live in certainly has less freedoms than you would have had in, say, the 1800s. But the problem here is that Grace Blakeley doesn't agree. Grace Blakeley wants to live in a utopia where freedom effectively means you get to do what you want all the time, a post-scarcity world. Well, I don't believe that that is ever a possibility. And I also don't believe it's virtuous to try and head towards a utopia, because I don't think it's real, and I think most of the time people's utopia, when it tries to work in reality, it turns into a dystopia. Because humans are irrational beings, and you can't have a perfectly rational utopia that actually serves irrational beings. The only way it's going to work is if we basically all become robots. And there's an awful lot of things in life that I like that would not work if I were a robot, such as friendships, relationships, basically anything emotional.
I think, we are fed this line that we live in this free market democratic system, right? And that's what capitalism is. Capitalism means free markets and democracy.
No, capitalism just means free markets. The private peoples owning the means of production rather than some centralised body owning the means of production. When it comes to democracy, no, an awful lot of people before universal suffrage really were saying that democracy is effectively just communism. I mean, even just reading 19th century critics of democracy, we can see that they include Thomas Carlyle, John Ruskin, Matthew Arnold, James Fitzjames, Stephen, Henry Maine and William Leckley. And these people are from all sorts of walks of life. Thomas Carlyle, obviously famous reactionary. Few Whigs in there, such as, I believe, Henry Maine, and I think even William Leckie was a supporter of the Whigs. And a lot of them came to a similar conclusion that Benjamin Evans Lippincott summarises here. They opposed democracy fundamentally for the same reason as Plato, that democracy led to disorder. Their unique historical contribution was to critique democracy under capitalism in modern industrial society. They believed that democracy produced anarchy in society, not simply anarchy within the individual, as Plato believed. And I mean, if you want to look at crime statistics, and I saw a video on Twitter literally just yesterday of someone robbing someone's car in their driveway just at gunpoint, and it doesn't seem to have led to anything. And obviously we're getting recent reports of police not bothering to even investigate every crime in Scotland. Lippincott proposed that their three leading doctrines were the common man's inferiority, the title of the few to rule, and authority. The main source of these ideas were Puritanism, middle-class ideas of power, and the classical education that they received in their youth. Which is quite ironic, because obviously Grace Blakeley got more of a classical education, as do a lot of people these days, and an awful lot of them turn out to be socialists. Other examples include Will Self, Christopher Hitchens, and an awful lot of people in the civil service. The three doctrines were most perfectly represented in Plato's Republic. While classical history seems to provide examples of the common man's inferiority, as in the case of Athens and Rome, which showed the populace turning to disorder, the three doctrines were developing during the Reformation and the Enlightenment by writers like John Calvin, Edmund Burke and David Hume. But the main point being here is that obviously, as I say, there were some Whigs in those examples, and even then the writers who were developing these ideals were people like Edmund Burke and David Hume, who again, we're both friends with Adam Smith and generally agreed with his perception that, well, a free market is good, invisible hand and all that. So the point I'm trying to get down to here is that capitalism does not mean democracy. Capitalism can have a democracy, but my God, you're going to need one hell of a constitution that says democracy cannot interfere with the market more than, 5%. But to say they need to go hand in hand, it's just wrong.
And the kind of incursion of the state into the economy limits freedom and creates this problem of big government.
Yeah, it's literally a problem that we've had ever since World War II, when the state said, we need to have total war, and therefore we need near total control of this country. And hell, it worked to win the war, sure, but then it made a post-war consensus, thanks to Keynes and a lot of his disciples, that we need to continue this to grow the economy, and, well, that's not been going particularly well over the 20th century. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's grown, but the argument is that under a more purely capitalist system, it would have grown a hell of a lot better and quicker.
And that results in this kind of dichotomized politics that we have at the moment, where it's basically just a debate between some people saying we need more market, less government, and other people saying we need more government, less market.
But that's not the main debate happening today. An awful lot of Tories, maybe not the membership, but certainly the MPs, and certainly since after this budget, there's seriously no actual will to lower the power of the state. Because why would Parliament want to do that? They are the state, and in an ideal world, they do have control over what laws and public finances happen, but realistically it's actually Whitehall that decides all that, and Whitehall is not going to give up the power that they have accrued over the last 30 years. That's just not going to happen. And when it comes to debates for normies, let's say, you know, Novara Media aren't wrong when they say most people want quote-unquote Corbynism. I mean, they're wrong to say they want Corbynism, because they don't want total socialism. It's a bit weird. So what the British people want is they want the best outcomes, but they also want policy that isn't going to get there. So everyone wants an NHS, but if the NHS isn't delivering the outcomes, which they haven't been doing for what, I don't know, 50, 60, probably 75 years to be honest, but just to be fair, 60 years, then, the NHS is in crisis, it's a funding problem, it's those damn Tories who are funding the damn thing better than ever anyway. Even Margaret Thatcher in interviews was proud to be upping the amount of money going towards the NHS. And it seems to be spreading to other things. The amount of people who are saying, oh, schools shouldn't have breakfast clubs, it's like 100 people on Twitter, in right-wing Twitter. I've not asked my mum or dad about this, who are my yardstick for understanding where the normie perspective is. I would not be surprised if they say, oh, well, what's your problem with that? On the other hand, depending on their mood, they might say, oh my god, parents are so lazy these days, what the hell is this? So it's hard to tell, but from polling, people don't mind the idea, or may even support, generally, the idea of nationalising our key industries, which I and about 10 other people in the UK are against. So, again, to make the point clear, most of the arguments these days are on about culture, because that's where the massive rift in society is. When it comes to trying to make the economy more free or more centralised, it's just a one-way ticket to going more centralised. And this is why we've had a complete shutdown of economic growth in realistic terms. GDP's really been going down because we've been allowing, you know, cities the size of Manchester in terms of population to come in once every year. And we are not building anything to try and support that. Houses are rarely being built, infrastructure is rarely being built. The government's even bringing in new water-saving measures to safeguard supplies. They are literally encouraging people to be more efficient with water, because no new reservoirs have been built since 1991. What's the reason for that? In a word, NIMBYs. Like, this is how screwed we are as a country. The government would literally rather bring in water rationing than actually build a reservoir.
And I just think that kind of divide is so just sterile and unhelpful.
I mean, I agree with you that it's completely sterile, because effectively, when you get in Liz Truss, who, by the way, yes, I would say that she was going against economic orthodoxy and going towards a more free market, but even then, what was her first step? Have the biggest public spending promise that we've ever had, which no one talks about. Everyone thinks that it was the tax cuts, it was this, that. No, what the markets were really worried about was they were going to give everyone in the UK money to pay for their gas and electricity bill. The problem was that they weren't means testing it, so millionaires who were heating their horses' stables would have got the money to pay for that, when realistically the plan should have been to means test it. Or if you're earning, I don't know, under 30,000 a year or something like that, or you know your household income's below 50,000, say, I don't know, I'm pulling this out my bum, then you get help to pay your bills, because obviously you're going to struggle more than other people. But they didn't do that. But the point being is that even when we move to a more free market system with Liz Truss, you still get massive government handouts. There's no debate about getting a more or less free market. We're just not having the debate at all. And the free marketeers are really bad at arguing that actually it's not the free market causing these problems, it is the government. Because when things like that are said, it's just memes like Grace Blakeley is memeing it here.
And this really came through, I think, during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I started writing this book, which just came out of the 2019 election defeat, and went straight into everything that was going on around COVID. And I started being asked, like, on, you know, mainstream TV, questions like, oh, well, you know, the government's spending loads of money. This is basically Corbynism. This is what you wanted. You got what you campaigned for.
Yes, well, this is the thing that a lot of idiot journalists don't understand. You know, Corbyn was definitely seen by the establishment as the left-wing populist that needed to be pushed away, and that's because, a bit like the right-wing, they wanted a complete overthrow of the way the system worked. It's just with Corbynism, what they want is basically just replace the elites and only let the BBC be the only news channel, fill it with socialists, renationalise everything at any expense, blah-de-blah-de-blah-de-blah, whereas The right wing especially want to defund the BBC, allow market plurality in a lot of ways, reform the NHS to be more market orientated, and again, the right wing that does want reform to this extent, such as myself, again, we're about 10 people. That's obviously hyperbolic. It's more like 100, maybe a couple of thousand on Twitter. Corbynism was basically everyone who was politically active between the ages of 18 and whatever age Owen Jones was, 35. And obviously, because we're like 5 years later at this point, they're pushing 40 now, probably slightly older. They will be making up most of the electorate, so I don't know why Politics Joe, Grace Blakeley and Navarro are so worried. You are going to get your radical left-wing parties, probably in about 20 years when you're the older folks and you're the ones going out voting while the younger ones are depressed and don't bother voting. But yes, the political journalist class, they are, as I say, idiots. And yes, they don't understand that you want complete reform and to throw everyone out and replace them with actual party men. They genuinely just think that you want to give more handouts out. And that's the thing. That's kind of a secondary objective for people like Grace Blakeley. And I understand that. And that's obviously why she wrote the book, to say, no, actually, we want to overthrow you.
And I started to realise that there was just this amazing, astonishing misunderstanding as to what capitalism actually is and what socialism is. People thought that capitalism meant, like free markets and the state not doing anything, despite the fact that actually existing capitalism everywhere has a very, very active role for the state. That spending that was taking place during COVID, it was basically the government funneling money into massive corporations, to landlords, into, the financial system.
Well, that, for a start, is just nonsense. Most of the extra money was spent on public services such as the NHS. And yes, there was support for businesses because businesses couldn't work. And Grace, just so you know, that furlough scheme was to pay the workers that you care so much about. That's where the public money went. It went to businesses to pay the workers. And yes, there was fraud involved in that. There's always going to be. And of course, there was support for individuals. Again, disabled people, people who suffered, had to go on ventilators, couldn't work, whatever. Most of this public money was spent exactly how she wants it, and she's trying to reframe it as, oh, but they sent it to businesses. Yeah, to businesses that were paying their employees money that they weren't making because the country shut down. As it says here, some of the most expensive schemes include Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme, the furlough scheme, and NHS Test and Trace, i.e. the stuff that Corbynites wanted. It's a fair thing to say, and she's trying to make it out that, oh no, it was all sent to Amazon. No, Amazon were doing fine. Amazon could still work. They were key workers for some reason, but your high street shops, your little corner news agents, no, they had to shut down. And guess what? The government paid for them to do that. The government literally had full control over the means of production. That is socialism, whether you like it or not. It may not be necessarily Marxist, but that doesn't matter. Unironically, capitalism is when the state isn't involved in things.
And somehow we're led to believe that is socialism, that the government propping up big business is socialism.
Again, Grace Blakeley is living proof that going to Oxford does not make you smart. Most of this money went to the NHS and to public services. Some of it went to support businesses, and of that money, that was there to mainly be put onto the furlough scheme to help workers, not live like paupers in the streets. When the government imposes a massive national lockdown and shuts down the country, yeah, it's going to be paying for that. Just because some of it happened to go to businesses doesn't mean it was a capitalist thing to do, you complete nincompoop.
So I kind of wanted to cut through that divide and say, this state versus market thing, it doesn't really work. It rests on this distinction between politics and economics. It doesn't really stand up in practice. Most of the time, the state is acting to defend the interests of big business, and big business is working within the state and alongside the state to do what it wants to do.
So somehow she worked that out, and yet, because she is so ideologically possessed by Marxism, doesn't take the extra steps to realise, oh, we're not actually in capitalism. No, people like Noam Chomsky keep saying we are. People like Richard Wolff keep saying we're in capitalism and therefore we must be. Because a bit like every part of intersectionality, the whole reason that these people are only ever taken seriously is because other people take them seriously, who have managed to have this almost revolving door going on through universities where effectively communists get in, they manage to make a reputation for themselves, manage to take over some institutions, and then because they've got that reputation behind them, say, right, this person's good, this person's good, this person's good. And it makes a network like that. And Grace Blakeley's near the bottom, don't get me wrong, but bleating the same talking points as Noam Chomsky, bleating the same talking points as Richard Wolff, Yeah, that's what gets you taken seriously in left-wing circles, and why you end up writing for Vice for 5 articles before they realise you're not worth the money because you don't know what you're talking about.
So how can we understand what like a kind of progressive liberatory politics actually means in that context?
I don't know what the hell she means by liberatory here, but I assume she's Mott and Baileying here and saying, oh, I'm really a liberal, not one of those icky communists, but it's not going to fly with the next few things she says.
And for me, this always comes back to the dirty word, Marxism. I think, there's so much misunderstanding as to what that means as well.
Yeah, part of the reason is because you support it, Grace Blakeley. Because at the end of the day, all Marxism is a shield or a almost acceptable philosophy for justifying your own revenge. Once you realise that most left-wingers are just out for revenge and out for violence, you realise that all the politics and all the philosophy is just window dressing. And Grace Blakeley's going to self-report a few times here.
And I kind of start the book by looking at these two quotes. One is from Marx, which is about him saying, the worker is treated as a kind of a bee under capitalism, where they just kind of follow orders and kind of buzz around the hive. Whereas actually they're architects. They learn to kind of create, they kind of yearn to create worlds in their head and bring those into being with their hands.
I mean, this is a bit of the Rousseauian assumptions of the state of nature being paradise, effectively. It's the annoying thing with Marxists, and I don't understand why they keep thinking this. I can only imagine that they think everyone actually has the capability to do this, because a lot of Marxists are probably, middling on the intelligence scale, probably slightly higher than middling, actually. And so they're able to be creative, but what do we do with, let's say, the people who aren't as talented in that regard? What are they going to do if they have nothing to do with their day? I mean, seriously, you see people on TikTok all the time, and yeah, some of them are making TikToks and joking about and entertaining, sure, but most of the time what they're doing on there is streaming themselves playing video games and having parasocial relationships. And I'm not being funny, the economics of that probably aren't particularly sustainable. The market's already flooded. I do the odd gaming stream, and they barely get any views because while I am good at games and while I am entertaining at the same time, I know this because I'm told both by my audience, I need to find a bit more of a niche. There aren't people reacting to these long-form interviews. There's barely anyone who's properly looking into politics, Joe, and what they say. And at that point, the problem is just marketing myself and networking, and that's where I suck. But even then, if I had all of my needs met with, I don't know what I'd be doing. Because I don't think I'd be a programmer. I don't think I'd be working the job I'm working at the moment, because the main reason I'm working for that is, of course, money and to do things. And this is the point that capitalists constantly make. Bakers don't make bread for other people out of some sort of altruism. They do it because they have a family to feed, and they're good at it, and they can sell it, and they know how to make good bread that people want to buy. And some creativity can come out of that. You go to a bakery, they make all sorts of cakes, and at the end of the day, their creativity is still stifled by what people want to buy. You go to an artisan cake bakery or whatever, and they'll make things for you to your specification, and then they'll make some things by themselves. But then if they have that creative edge and make something that they just put on display, you have to kind of hope that someone actually wants to buy it. And if people aren't buying your creative endeavours, then there's no point making it, and you won't make it anymore. That's the invisible hand.
And I contrast that with the quote from this free market, the kind of darling of the neoliberals, Hayek, who basically says freedom of thought is only of relevance to a small minority.
I'm afraid that's just true. It is quite true. Most people are just NPCs. Most people aren't like free thinkers, I'm afraid to say. I don't know whether I'd put myself in this category or not either, because most of the things I'm saying, they are effectively things that other people have said. I can't really think of many original ideas, and to be honest with you, I can't think of many people who have original ideas these days. Elon Musk doesn't really have original ideas. He's just very, very good at making money and then investing that money in things he thinks are worthwhile, electric cars and Twitter. So what he means by that is when Marx says, oh, all these people are free thinkers and they're trying to be creative, but they're actually stuck in this capitalist system where they can't be creative, Hayek says, do you actually talk to these people? All they really want to do after work is have a beer and watch football. They don't care about your poetry. They don't care about your, high-end arts college films. They just want to watch some Marvel movies, have a beer, spend time with their family, watch whatever entertaining stuff they want to watch and go from there. That's what he means, but then, Politics Joe and Grace Blakeley take that as a massive insult because they think themselves as free thinkers because that puts them on a higher social status, where in reality, a lot of us are just NPCs. We're 90% chimp, 10% bee. And even chimps are stuck in hierarchical systems, so we're kind of screwed when it comes to having many free thinkers.
And it's him and actually even Keynes and most of the big thinkers that we hold up in our political debate, they basically all believe, whether they're on the centre left or the centre right, that the vast majority of people should not be given the power to govern themselves.
No, you've completely misunderstood the quote then. Their point is that when they are self-governing, they are not going to be these radical free thinkers and creative types that you have made them out to be. Effectively, when they self-organise, they are going to want to be part of a system because most people do just want to work a job where they're told what to do, essentially. Have a routine, and I'm going to be honest with you, I don't think most people want to think about politics. I think that's why most people just vote tribally. Oh, the Tories are evil because they're going to destroy the NHS, vote for us. If they were genuine free thinkers, they'd look into those claims and realise it's all nonsense. If you were a free thinker, you would look into that claim and find out that it's actually nonsense, that the Tories are privatising the NHS. It's always nonsense. But you don't do that. And the reason is because you're not a creative, critical thinking type. No, you're like the rest of us. You're part of a system, you're a cog in the machine, and you don't even realise it. And given you think you live in a free society and you think yourself a free thinker, no. Even you, by your own revealed preference, want to be a cog in the machine. So welcome to life. We all basically just want a society that we feel like is working for us and working for our countrymen. That's the basis of it.
Because they're too stupid or they're too impulsive or they don't understand the stakes of the decisions that they're making.
As far as I'm aware, Hayek and Keynes weren't staunch opponents to universal suffrage and democracy, so I don't know if that was the argument that they were making. Again, I think their point is that they actually keep voting for a system where they effectively don't have to do very much. I mean, that was the whole point of Road to Serfdom. The point of Road to Serfdom wasn't that people are stupid and are going to go into totalitarianism because people are too stupid to realise what they're doing. No, it was more of a, you're going to sleepwalk into it because slowly, if the government gets more and more and more power, you're going to find it harder and harder and harder to actually avoid it going totalitarian. So please think carefully about what you're voting for. And then obviously it's a prophecy that's effectively going to become true. Some would say it's already true thanks to COVID, but luckily there seems to have been enough pushback where effectively people forget it happened now. But if they can do it once, they can do it again. And, I think Labour would be more inclined to have kept us in a lockdown for a lot longer until the economic forces became too much for them.
Whereas for me, the fundamental insight of Marxism is that the only way we get to liberation, the only way we get to a fair and just society is when people take power, when they take power within their workplaces, in their communities, over political life as a whole. Because politicians aren't going to listen to you if you don't demand it. Corporations certainly aren't going to behave themselves if you don't force them to. It's really up to us to actually begin to kind of build the society that we want from the ground up.
I mean, there's your first self-report, by the way. That's just, we want to overthrow everything. And we're not going to be quote-unquote free until we do it. I mean, again, the thing you have to ask people who say this is, where has that worked? How is Venezuela going? And initially they'll just say that's not real socialism, and at that point you can just say, well, can we just say it's never worked then? As soon as you get to the point where you can implement socialism, no one implements it, and you're going to be no better than that, no matter how clever you think you are. And they might take it or not, but at the end of the day, the argument about socialism doesn't really matter. As far as I'm concerned, the book, Socialism, the Failed Idea That Never Dies, absolutely destroyed the left when it comes to wanting socialism, because every time the same thing happens. Oh, look at this country, it's going socialist, isn't that great? Oh, look at that, they're improving things based on their propaganda. And then some leftist academics then go over to these countries and they are either shown a load of fake stuff, or some of them are killed for, I don't know, wearing glasses in Cambodia, say. And then when it inevitably all falls apart within the next 5 to 10 years, then you easily see that they all scurry away and say, no, we never supported that, was never real socialism. It's every time. There's no point debating it. They're never going to accept that socialism is wrong. They have to discover it themselves, and they have ample evidence these days.
What does Marxism mean to you?
Yeah, totally. So as a kind of way of understanding capitalism, It's, as you say, a kind of mode of analysis that begins by looking at the way that we produce things as a society.
Yeah, and Karl Marx luckily had an awful lot of opportunities to actually do that, given that his friend Friedrich Engels owned a factory. Did he ever go there for himself and actually ask the people there what they want? Did he? Hell. The man just sat on his bum for so long that he ended up with bum boils and effectively wrote revenge porn earlier in his life, and to be fair to him, got a bit more reformist as time went on, but my lord. He is a man whose analysis I can't take seriously. And I've made hundreds of videos saying why I can't take him seriously when it comes to his political economy and all that, but I also recently found out he tried to disprove basic mathematics, where he tried to disprove derivatives by dividing by zero. If you get a division by zero in any equation, you've gone wrong somewhere. And in fact, the whole point of derivatives is that they can get very close to zero, but can never be zero. That's part of the law. And Marx thought he disproved it by agreeing with the law. And my point here is that if Marx can think he has completely destroyed the whole concept of calculus with something this simple, then it's fair to say if all his simple solutions are stupid. I do mean all of them, because, you know, based off this alone, you can say that because this is so unfathomably stupid that when you start going to complex systems like the economy, of course he's going to screw it up more. But even then, when you look at his economic ideas, everywhere they've tried to be implemented, it's been horrible. One day his idea will be seen as cringe and blue-pilled, but that day will not come for another few decades, I'm afraid. I think our best chance of that is when we can finally get to the one place that has been untouched by capitalism.
Space!
So rather than, say, looking at like the prevailing ideas within a society and saying, you know, history is driven forward by these great battles between different, you know, groups of ideologies or different sets of ideas, Marxism says most of what happens within our society is shaped by the conditions in which things are produced.
Yes, material conditions change human nature. I understand that is part of Marx's basic philosophy, and it's just wrong. You still have tribalism everywhere you go in history. You still have warfare everywhere you go in history. I mean, part of the reason that Europe is united at the moment is partially because of, obviously, World War II. It's, oh, let's never have a war again. Yeah, it didn't last very long when, you know, you have this big bad enemy Russia at the other side of Europe, to Britain anyway, that is slowly encroaching across. And alright, you don't exactly have a large-scale hot war, but you have plenty of proxy wars and plenty of spying and espionage. Hell, it has been millennia of humans going through different material conditions. We're still only able to write the same 7 basic stories. Now, human attitudes and human morality might change, but human nature at its very core, I'm afraid that's pretty consistent and is going to be throughout humans' existence. This is why basically nobody can actually write a futuristic, say, sci-fi novel that's actually in any way a utopia, because humans are incapable of living in a utopia. This was part of Dostoevsky's work. As Jordan Peterson constantly summarises, you get a utopia, you get a perfect world, you'll break it all down just so something interesting happens.
And the insight about capitalism is that it is a social system that rests upon the fact that some people own all the things that we need to produce things, and there's this big class of people who cannot survive other than by selling their labour power for a living.
Oh, it's such a tedious way to think about the world. There have been people who were working in factories 30 years ago, something like that, who, you know, learned about all these engineering concepts, learned about mechanics, learned about electrical engineering and what have you. And they have gone on to make businesses, both successful and failures. And an awful lot of them are finding it quite difficult to get anywhere. Yes, because of our economic system, but that's because it's not capitalist. You know, they're being taxed up to the eyeballs. They've had governments go against them because they don't want limited companies owning public office spaces, despite the fact that they'd be renting it anyway. Some of them have looked like they're on the verge of becoming a big, massive company, and then, oh, what happens? I don't know, COVID hits. Oh, you know, the next budget's coming out, and it turns out they're going to have to pay more in corporation tax, or it turns out that the workers want more money and need to change jobs because they can't afford to pay them anymore because, oh, look, national insurance or income tax has gone up. Hell, I know self-employed people that keep having to write reports on things like the gender pay gap when they're the only person working for the self-employed company. they still have to deal with, inclusivity and diversity and all that. The state is absolutely everywhere. And as mentioned before, who owns McDonald's? The answer, everyone. If McDonald's collapses tomorrow, that is part of your pension fund gone. And that's similar with an awful lot of big companies that are publicly traded. If a company is publicly traded, the investors are effectively everyone. Or at least everyone who's earning enough to contribute to their own private pension or who has an ISA. Because the best way to keep money going is by circulating it. What's a good way to circulate it? Put it into investment funds like that. Grace Blakeley doesn't understand a damn thing.
So just as an example, there's a difference between capitalism, this social system based on the production of commodities, class-based system based on the production of commodities, and feudalism, which is the system that revolves around land, where you have an aristocracy that's in charge.
I bring up Richard Wolff before, and if she starts going into how this modern system is actually feudalism or in any way related to feudalism, I'm going to go absolutely nuts, because that is exactly what Richard Wolff says, and I don't know why people take it seriously. The whole idea got ripped apart by Destiny, of all people.
And again, this is about how things are produced. Like, the political dynamics of feudalism come back to the fact that a small class owns all the land and the peasants have to work it to get what they need to subsist. In the same way, the insight of Marxism is that it's this class-divided society oriented around the production of commodities which are sold for profit.
Yeah, so she's trying to say that what we live in is actually just neo-feudalism. It's crazy. And it's a ridiculous thing to say, because more than 90% of the country's 2018 rich list, made of billionaires and millionaires, are self-made. The 94% of the 1,000 people on the list is made up of self-made entrepreneurs, the highest level ever. It compares with just 43% of self-made people who were included in the first list in 1989, when inherited wealth dominated the list. And so you go through neoliberalism, what happens? Most people become billionaires. In fact, the vast majority, almost all of them, become millionaires and billionaires through self-made processes, by making businesses, by selling Harry Potter books. The point is that the class of the Marxists, the lords, the people born into wealth, doesn't really exist anymore. It's 6% of the rich people of the Sunday Times' rich list. It's actually incredible how we are still talking about Marxism when money isn't really staying in the hands of the rich anymore. The money's being made by these people. Some of them, as we said with J.K. Rowling, single mothers who don't have very much. So to try and say it's like feudalism, yeah, it's ridiculous. We do not have these great dynasties anymore. And if we do, you're looking at it more in the political realm than anywhere else.
And that is undertaken through this class division, this social division of labour, where basically working people, the people who are forced to sell their labour power, are exploited by the ones who own things, because they own the stuff that everyone else needs just to be able to live.
I mean, even this isn't necessarily true, because according to the ONS, at most it's 9% of British households who actually own an additional residence, and they say no more than 9% because 4% own a second home outright and 5% own buy-to-let. So that is second property, but it's being rented out, so it's not like they're hoarding it. They're providing the service for other people to live in the house without a deposit or any of the other ridiculous things you have to go through to get a mortgage. I know, because I have one. And this is actually low on the scale when it comes to Europe. The same article goes through other European countries, and as you can tell, we are on the lower side of that list, equaling Poland or even Austria. So when it comes to all the people in the UK hoard all the wealth, especially when it comes to basic needs, it's just not true. And this isn't even touching upon food being as cheap as it ever has been.
And it's from that you then begin to understand the dynamics that I highlight in the book. Because, the other way of looking at capitalism is, as I've said, that it's a system based on, private property and free markets, basically. And then you have these ideas that only human freedom can be protected by free markets, and free markets are the only systems that lead to kind of democracy and respect for human rights and all those different sorts of things.
She's brought democracy into it again, and I've already gone through that. Democracy is not needed with free market capitalism. In fact, I'd actually argue it goes against free market capitalism. I think true free market capitalism are about as close as you could get to a minarchy, which is what I want, to not have universal suffrage, having it based on property ownership or at least something to prove that you've got skin in the game would be a hell of a lot better for that. But when people say democracy these days, they mean universal suffrage, which is an experiment we've run for about 100 years, and, well, I suppose it's all right, but there are certain things that we could definitely improve with it by shaking it up a bit. However, I am very much on the side of if you protect private property and if you enforce property rights, then yes, you have a very, very free society that allows people to act with the maximum freedom you can probably expect in reality, while not having society fall apart into anarchy. And ironically, socialist countries tend to get more authoritarian and have less freedoms for their people, so, take from that what you will.
That's the kind of lie that we're told about the way capitalism works.
Well, annoyingly, you've got to bear in mind that when she says capitalism, she means the corporatist structures that we live in today, that, again, not many capitalists really defend. The thing is, I find myself refuting a lot of what Grace Blakeley is saying because the initial criticisms are just dead wrong. And the more annoying part is that she is saying that this is capitalism as well. So she's naming the damn thing wrong to try it because effectively Marx's idea was call it capitalism, make it part of the capitalist class, and then destroy it, and Marxists still follow that to this day, as we're seeing here, except they're applying it to a system that is quite different to how it was in the 1800s. But then she's also saying because this is capitalism and capitalism isn't delivering on the promises that it gave, therefore it's wrong anyway. But again, we don't live in capitalism, so the whole point's moot. And that's specifically what I'm refuting, rather than saying that the system we live in is capitalism and it's good, because I don't think it's either.
But if you start from this perspective of seeing capitalism as this system that's based basically on class domination, then things start to make a little bit more sense.
Again, a class so dominating that out of all the richest 1,000 people in the world at the moment, 94% of them are self-made. This class domination is going so goddamn well that the rich people are failing to keep their money and failing to stay on top. Just a total fiction.
Because we don't actually have free markets.
Then why in God's name are you calling it capitalism? What is wrong with you? You've just gone through a whole explanation of, oh, this is capitalism, we see it here, 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 and here, it's all about free markets. And then you say, oh, but we don't actually have free markets. No, hang on, that's my line. You're not supposed to take that. And if you are saying that we don't actually have free markets, well, ipso facto, we can't have and be living in capitalism then, can we? So why are you still calling it? Oh, it's to signal to your tribe, this is bad. Hey everyone on my side, I am your thought leader, this is bad. Don't worry about me contradicting myself, it doesn't matter. This is bad in capitalism, alright? Yeah, see corporations, they're stealing your money, grrr.
There's lots of examples in this book where I show that most of the major industries within the world economy are dominated by one or two firms that are deeply corrupt and in the pockets of politicians and vice versa.
Yeah, that's exactly what capitalists are complaining about. Don't take their criticisms, say that it is your own, and then say capitalists actually want this. That is a nasty thing to do, and it's not even true. The only people defending this are the people set to gain from it. In other words, people already in the government who are making a nice sum of cash off producing the statistics and supporting the conclusions that they already have. We see this all the time. We saw it with Sage when it came to COVID. You see it with the OBR and IFS constantly. We follow what they say. Oh, look, we're in a recession.
So I start with the example of Boeing, right, which has been in the news recently for the doors blowing off its planes at about 13,000 feet in the air.
Oh, interesting. I saw headlines from right-wing articles saying that this was all down to diversity and inclusion. I wonder what the left-wing side of the argument is.
This comes on the back of these crashes that took place several years ago now, where over 350 people died in two separate crashes where Boeing planes just nosedived out of the air. People at Boeing knew about the flaws in this plane before it was put on the market. They deleted references to the system that caused the problem in the pilot manual. They didn't tell anyone what was going on. These concerns weren't raised. When the planes did crash, they tried to blame the pilots. The FAA, the regulator, basically did nothing. And throughout all of this, the American state was channeling billions of dollars worth of tax cuts and subsidies into Boeing.
So Grace actually jumped from the doors flying off planes in midair to an issue that actually happened, as you say, a few years ago. And from what I can tell, it's true. Boeing admitted it knew about the problem with its 737 MAX jets a year before the aircraft was involved in 2 fatal accidents, but took no action. The firm said it inadvertently made an alarm feature optional instead of standard, but insisted that it did not jeopardise flight safety, despite the fact, obviously, that it got 300 odd people killed. But it gets worse than that. It was a feature that was known as the angle of attack disagree alert and was designed to let pilots know when two different sensors were reporting conflicting data. The planemaker said it had intended to provide the feature as standard but did not realise until deliveries had begun that it was only available if airlines purchased an optional indicator. And it's things like this where I can see why people say capitalism is absolutely ridiculous. Because yes, basic safety features should be standard when you're buying the most basic things of, say, a car or any other type of vehicle. It said it had intended to deal with the problem in a later software update, but this is where I get a bit apologetic about it. Yes, they never intended it to work like this. It happened by accident, and then they never actually got around to fixing it. And that is awful, and yes, I agree with Grace Blakeley. People should be punished for that, and Boeing and the Aviation Authority should absolutely be punished for this complete disregard of safety. But as usual, we can say, well, this isn't just a fault of capitalism's anyway, because Chernobyl.
And I think what that shows is that this argument that, let's say this problem with Boeing, right? It shows that the market doesn't work and we need to hand more power to the government. Well, actually, the government was just as involved with this as the executives at Boeing.
Again, this is just making my arguments for me. Literally, these past few clips have been her saying, oh, the capitalists are actually right, we don't really live under capitalism, but I still want the state to have more power, despite, as she says, the state allow private companies get away with things that they absolutely shouldn't be able to get away with because there's some nasty dealings going on. If you, say, didn't have a government or had a competent government, then Boeing would collapse as an airline or suffer a huge financial loss overnight due to this, but that isn't happening.
And it's because capitalism is this system where everything is oriented around making sure that the people who are in control of the production process basically get what they want, right?
Again, this is corporatism. The most you'd see of the corruption between state and private businessmen in the Victorian era was acts by Parliament to allow for railways to be built, because you had to have acts of Parliament go through to create railway junctions and railway lines, because obviously it was all the King's land, or Queen's land, since it was Queen Victoria. And that would be it. It was essentially a rubber stamp to say, yes, these railway tycoons can build their train lines because it's for the good of the public and for the good of them. And guess what? The railways absolutely exploded in Victorian times, and we still use Victorian lines to this day, because the businessmen wouldn't have had state subsidies or bailouts from the state if they were bad railway systems. And it's the best the train lines have ever been. And then they got nationalised, things got progressively worse, then they were reprivatised by John Major. We saw 4 years of the most investment we've ever seen in the train line in the 20th century, and then Tony Blair half renationalised it, half left it privatised, and it's the worst of both worlds. In fact, the train lines are the best example of what Grace is trying to say here, and obviously they keep saying it's privatised when it's not privatised at all. Tick History is a good video on why not.
And so the only way to push back against that isn't to say, let's give more power to politicians, because, half the time they're in the pockets of these guys. It's actually to say, how do we pull power down? So how could workers within Boeing have organised to resist both their exploitation and the kind of corruption of this company?
Well, the workers could have whistleblown. Wouldn't be surprised if the only people that knew this was an issue were the people in software development, and trust me when I say, probably about 2 of the developers will have known of the issue and probably thought nothing of it, because obviously they're told on top, oh, don't worry about it. I don't think the workers will have had a chance to even think that this was an issue. In fact, the software developers in charge of it, it probably would have been an optional thing at first, and then obviously when they're changing that about, things get lost in the documentation, Chinese whispers is played, and yeah, they didn't make it a standard feature, they kept it in the paid features portion of the software, and then they didn't realise till too late, and then you've got other things that the software developers need to put their time into, and that thing just gets stuck in the backlog, and then you end up with this disaster. So it's like, what could other workers done? I don't think the workers will have done a lot more differently. And we've not heard of anyone come out or whistleblow that this is a top-to-bottom thing. This genuinely does just seem like one huge disaster that came about because priorities were misallocated to different areas of the software development. So, what would the workers do differently? Maybe prioritise it different. We don't know if that means that they'll put the prioritisation of this system up or down, though? We don't know. But all Grace Blakeley knows is that she likes the idea of workers having control over the businesses that they work for, and therefore that's got to be a good thing. But her logic here isn't flying. It's not making much sense.
And there's another example of in the book I look at, of the Lucas plan, where workers in an aerospace company in the UK did just that. They kind of organised to try and take control of the firm.
And yet that plan failed, and Lucas Aerospace went defunct in 1996, and I believe part of it merged with American companies as well. Despite support from the Labour government and trade unions, the plan for the workers to take over an aerospace company that wasn't making an awful lot of money ended up not going through anyway, despite this being in 1976, when nationalising industries was all the rage. Because at the end of the day, you've got to keep these companies profitable to actually keep them going. Just having workers in charge doesn't mean it will be profitable, and I would not be shocked if people at the time actually understood that. Anyway, at that point, they move on to another tangent, and I think I'm going to save that for a part 2, because I don't want to make videos that last 2 hours long. It's Friday, we're supposed to be having fun, and at this point, Grace Blakeley hasn't said an awful lot that is particularly intelligent. It's mainly just been some things happen, and they happen to all coincide with what I think of the world, but then you actually look into it just slightly and the claims she's making, and an awful lot of it doesn't exactly support her. I won't go as far as saying capitalism has no problems, but what I will say is an awful lot of the problems people say it has are either non-problems, i.e. inequality happens, or they're completely unavoidable phenomena, such as, for example, inequality happens. But at the end of the day, if people can have their own choices to buy what they like or work how they like from the opportunities put forward to them, I don't see an issue with a system like that, and I think it's about as good as it's going to get. Unfortunately, we're not quite at that stage yet, and we are far too regulated to actually have any growth, and this is why an awful lot of companies, which I am sure Grace Blakeley won't go into, want a bunch of mass immigration to happen, because effectively it's just cheap labour. And that ups their profits, and maybe that is a free market, but hey, there are social and cultural issues that we have to worry about as well. So we've got that to worry about. I mean, I say that. The economic ideal that mass migration improves the economy, that's been taking a beating recently as well, so maybe that isn't actually the free market. Maybe, again, that is just corporatism. But anyway, I will talk more about these issues in part 2. For now, that's everything I had for you today. So, once again, thank you very much for listening, and until next time, goodbye.